Awesome. All right. We are live. Okay, great. Hello to anyone that has logged on so far. We are just going to give 2 minutes for folks to trickle in, and then we'll get started. Welcome back on stage. Hey, Alex. I was just saying we'll give people 1 or 2 minutes to jump in, and then we'll get started.
Cool. Yeah, that wasn't a great start to the event for me. I managed to just exit the tab, but I'm back. So I'm back in the room.
I was a little worried I did not do something I was supposed to do since you
No,
disappeared for a
exactly.
second, Alex.
I was nervous, so I just exited out.
At least you came back. Livestorm is so tricky.
Yeah. Actually, I just used my history, so that was easy.
Oh, perfect. Perfect. Okay, I can see we're recording. I can see we're live. So I'll give it just 1 more minute and then we'll kick off. All right, I think we can go ahead and jump on in. The question tab is open. If anyone wants to ask questions throughout, you can drop them directly into that chat. They're private. They'll come right to me on the back end, and I'll pose them to our speakers at the end. Otherwise, we're going to roll right into the questions that we had submitted, and we should have time for any additional ones that kind of come up throughout the presentation. So to kick us off, I'm Kaylee. I'm our events manager at Omnipresent, and we're really thrilled to be running our first legal office hours event of 2025. We have Stan Broome here, our co-general counsel and vice president of litigation and risk management. I think that's the longest job title that we have at Omnipresent. And we're also joined by Alex Henderson, our awesome head of sales. And together we're going to have a really casual conversation, kind of working through all of the questions that have been submitted. Between them, Alex and Stan have advised hundreds of companies on how to scale global teams compliantly and what to look out for when you're choosing an EOR partner. So we've had some really awesome questions already submitted. Thank you to the folks who sent them in, and I think we'll be able to cover all of them today, which is awesome. So whether you are just getting started with international hiring, you're already working with an EOR and considering switching, you're thinking about scaling to new different countries, we hope this session gives you clarity, confidence, and a lot of practical insights. Great, so let's get started. So Stan, I'm going to kick off with you. A lot of questions that came in and that we get often is just around kind of the 101 of working with an EOR provider. And so if we were to start there, like top line, how do companies think about staying compliant and understanding the nuances of EORs across the globe?
That's a great question, and I think we'll probably hit on several of these themes throughout the call today. But the one thing that I'm so proud of Omnipresent is that we emphasize this global compliance. So I thought we might spend, with that question, I thought we might spend just a little bit of time with me explaining how it is that we managed to do that. So we are in 162 different countries. It may be more than that now. And I get asked by my colleagues in the legal world outside of EOR all the time, how on earth do you manage to stay up to date on all the rules, regulations, laws, changes in each of those for all of those countries? And I'll kind of walk you through how we do it, and it starts to make sense. But while I'm talking about this, I want you to also think about the fact that not every EOR does it this way, and you really need to ask the right questions to figure out whether or not you can trust the advice that you're getting when you join an EOR. But the way we do it at Omnipresent is, first of all, we look for trends. So we break the world down into trends, and we keep close tabs on what's going on in the laws and regulation fields that govern the employer-employee relationship. And you can put those in buckets from countries that are laissez-faire and there's not a whole lot of regulation, and you sort of start with the U.S. on one end, and you get all the way down to Germany or France, some other countries like that that are much more restrictive and really keep close tabs on employers and are very employee protective. So first of all, we just sort of break things down, and then the practical, real way that we do it every day is I run a legal team that has lawyers and paralegals literally around the world. And their task every single day when they wake up for 8 hours or 10 hours or 12 hours or however hard I'm pushing them is to make sure that we do this. And we do it that we stay up front and current. And we do it through a number of resources. We have trade associations, legal periodicals that we scan literally every single day. And then we're alerting each other as if I hear something that's going on in my part of the world, I flag that for other places, other people on my team who live in places and are responsible for geographies that might be taking a similar trend. So that's sort of the big picture way that we do it, Callie. And I'm guessing as we get more questions, we can talk specifically about how we address those changes and alert our clients when those regulations and laws change and how we deal with that. But I'll get us started by at least giving that introduction.
That's super helpful. And I actually don't think I've ever heard that side from the legal team of like the nuts and bolts of how, like, on a day-to-day basis you stay up to date. That's super interesting.
I have to
Um,
say, it's really fascinating to me that we're able
really.
to do it. And, coming from, I practiced in law firm arenas for 25 years before I came to the EOR space. And it's almost mind blowing and overwhelming to think that you would be responsible for that depth of knowledge across the world. But it comes together. But I do have to say, we rely on an amazing team of young, ambitious lawyers that are stationed all over the world.
Yeah. Yeah, incredible. And from your perspective, Alex, sort of on the sales side and on the when prospects are coming to us, like what are people looking for or thinking about when they're reflecting on hiring globally for the first time? Like what are you seeing and hearing in those conversations? Oh, you're muted. Classic. Wouldn't be a webinar without a couple mutes.
That's right.
I know. I was all ready to go then as well. Thanks, Kaylee, and thanks, Stan, as well. Yeah, what I think is so interesting is when people are coming to hire internationally for the first time is when they kind of start realizing actually how complex and how different local labour law is in every single country. So I'll give you an example. If you are a US-based company and you've predominantly hired within the US, and maybe you've gone a little bit outside, maybe you've also hired in Canada, you might think, oh, we've got a bit of experience of hiring internationally. However, if you then go to mainland Europe, you will see that within, mainland Europe, you have places like France, Germany, Spain, Italy, countries that all sit, from a geographical perspective, quite close together. However, they all have their own requirements around benefits, probation, termination, leave, and what compliant looks like in all of those countries is very different. And I think really for our customers coming to us, they're really thinking like, how are we going to navigate this? How are we going to make sure that we're compliant, that we're offering these amazing benefits in countries that look so different?
Yeah, and Katie, before we move to the next one, when Alex was talking, it reminded me of one other thing too that I think is really important if you're thinking about hiring globally, and that is, yes, you have to get great advice on the laws. Yes, you have to know the regulations and when they change. Yes, you have to know the difference in, like Alex was saying, benefits and things like that, country to country. But there's another layer that's just as important as all of that, and that is local custom and local cultural knowledge. And an example that comes to mind is you could be completely compliant and still not be able to recruit the best talent because you are missing something on the cultural element or on what is considered a norm in a particular country that any highly qualified candidate is going to be expecting. And if you don't have that inside information, then you're not going to attract the best talent. And just as an example, in the United States, you could be completely compliant and not offer any matching to your 401k, the pension plan in the United States, retirement plan in the United States. You could not even know about that, but you're not going to get the best talent, because if I were interviewing for a job and you told me that you weren't going to do a matching 401k at some level, I wouldn't be interested in coming abroad. So that is why we have strategically placed members of my legal team literally all around the world, because yes, I need the black letter law. I absolutely have to have that, but I also need that nuance that tells me that, hey, this particular benefit, everybody gets a meal allowance in this particular country. If you asked a U.S. Recruiter about a meal allowance, they might not even know what you were talking about. But in some countries in Europe, it would be absolutely expected. So I think both. I think you need, anybody can give you the black letter law, but you also have to have that local knowledge.
Yeah, I'm glad you jumped in with that, because that didn't come up in a lot of the questions for today, but it's such an important other layer when you're thinking about evaluating a provider and also just hiring globally in general. And so maybe to stay on this topic, you both have touched on this, so either of you feel free to jump in, and maybe it doesn't boil down to one thing, but if you had to pick one sort of legal risk that companies typically are underestimating when they first start hiring internationally, is there something that comes top of mind?
You want me to jump in, Alex? Okay. Something came immediately to mind when you said that, Callie. Everyone, when they're first starting to hire globally, thinks about onboarding. They think about, how am I going to recruit the best person? What are the qualifications that I need? That kind of thing. That is not where your mind needs to be. You need to go to the other end. The thing that clients underestimate is the other end of the spectrum: offboarding, terminations, severance. What happens when the employer-employee relationship goes off the tracks? Because that's when it gets risky. That's when it gets expensive. That's when you can find yourself in front of an employment tribunal that is probably biased towards the employee. So what I try to tell our clients all the time is, I know you're excited about hiring this person. I know you're excited about going into this new geography, but you really need to understand not what's going to happen at the beginning of the relationship, what's going to happen at the end of the relationship. Am I going to have to pay 3 months salary? Am I going to have to pay 2 years salary? Those are important considerations. And I think I call it entrepreneurial exuberance. I think when we're first hiring somebody, we're excited about it. We think the relationship is going to be wonderful. And most of the time it is. But you really, really need to check yourself and talk to your EOR about what is the local law. And here again, this is where custom comes in. What are employees expecting at the end of the when they're terminated? What kind of severance package are they expecting? And it varies greatly across the world. And you will also want to understand that, because you may decide to hire in a different place. You may decide, termination costs in this country are really high compared to a different country, and I can get the same talent both places. And you need to be thinking about the end of the relationship, not just the beginning of the relationship. So that's how I would answer the question of one thing that clients underestimate.
Yeah, and interesting, Stan, that you say that. And I think, Kaylee, I think this was one of the questions, so I hope I'm not jumping ahead too much here. But actually, I think, what should buyers really be digging into when they're thinking about compliance? Because I think the first thing to understand here is that you're never going to speak to an EOR provider who's going to say they're non-compliant.
Yeah.
Everyone is going to say we're compliant. But what does that actually mean to be compliant? And one thing I would say is really important here is, the people that you are speaking to in those initial conversations need to be having an upfront and honest conversation with you about the limitations of these models. And a good example of this might be somewhere like Germany, where actually the law is very black and white when it comes to EOR. One of our fantastic German lawyers, Dan, will tell you it's actually a great country to operate in, because the law is very straightforward there in what is and isn't allowed from an EOR perspective. But it's, we would love to be able to say to our clients that they can operate for as long as they would like in Germany, but that's actually not the reality of the situation. There is that 18-month limitation. And although we do have a solution post 18 months, that that is a different solution, and our clients and our prospects really need to be aware of that beforehand. So I think, making sure that your employer of record understands the limitations, the risks, and presents those to you up front is such an important part of knowing that you are with a trusted provider.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Germany is a great example, Alex. I'm so proud that Omnipresent has completed at least 2. Maybe we're working, I guess, on our 3rd audit, and the German government really keeps close tabs. So you definitely want to be with an EOR who is licensed and understands how to operate in countries that are strict like Germany. And then you can go to other countries where you need a different type of advice, because the advice, say in Spain, is that, hey, the law says this, but we're actually operating in a slightly different way. What is the risk there, and is this something that that we see a lot of investigations from the government authorities, or is this something that they all know goes on and just sort of overlooks? So you need both sides of that compliance. You need not only to know what the compliance rules are, you also need to know what the regulatory environment is. So how often are the regulators really coming down on employers? Because, for example, when you get into Latin America, there is a set of rules, but there's also a set of unwritten rules, and you have to know both sides of that. And you cannot say that you are a compliant EOR if you don't understand both sides of that equation. And if I'm sitting in the client's position, I wouldn't want, and I know, Alex, your team is so good at this, but I wouldn't want the salesperson just telling me what I wanted to hear. I would want them to tell me, hey, you need to know that the law says X. Everybody in this particular area of the world operates in Y. We've never had a problem with it, but you need to know that that risk still exists. We'll help you and walk you through it, but you need to know that up front. And don't you think, Alex, that our salespeople do a great job at sort of putting both of those out there? I love that the sales team, is motivated to close that deal, but I don't think we do it at all cost. And I'm afraid that some of our competitors probably lean a little towards the, oh, it'll all be fine, don't worry about it conversation. And I hope that we don't do that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We monitor our what we would call talk ratios really closely in the sales team. And that's something that I'm really interested in, because what I want to see, especially in our initial consultations with our prospects, is that our prospects are talking a lot more than we are. And that's because in order for us to give guidance about the best possible solution, we really need to understand the situation that our prospects are in. So yeah, making sure that when I see those talk ratios really high on our prospect side, that gives me a good indication that we are doing that well.
Oh, I love that stat. This is awesome. And we can just stay with this question for a couple more minutes, because we've jumped right into evaluating EOR providers, how to think about it from sort of this 360 perspective. And so maybe, Alex, just when you are kind of on the front lines with folks coming to Omnipresent for various reasons, first question would be what does it mean when we're saying we're transparent and compliant? What is that looking like? Both of you have kind of answered that already. And then 2, just are there certain reasons that folks are switching? Are there any themes that kind of jump out when people are coming over from maybe a different provider?
Yeah, well, when it comes to when we say we're compliant, we're really happy to talk to you about the licenses that we use in countries to make sure that, as Stan talked about, we're using the model that is most appropriate. If you've got an EOR provider you're speaking to who isn't ready to show you those certificates or even talk to you about the way they are licensed, that for me would be a little bit of a red flag. I'd be a bit unsure about how they were pitching themselves as compliant if they couldn't talk about that in a bit more detail. I guess anything else, Stan, that you'd add to that kind of compliance piece before we go on to the kind of switching side?
Yeah, I would be very concerned about misclassification risk, and I would be very concerned about any EOR who told you that, hey, you know what, you can make this much easier if you don't call them employees, we'll just call everybody a contractor. And that type of advice, and there are plenty of companies out there that are doing that, but that's going to get you in trouble on multiple layers. It's going to get you in trouble with the tax authorities. And that's the piece that if you are not compliant with the local tax authorities. I don't care which country you're in. I don't care which state you're in. If you're like in the United States or a province in Canada, if you don't get the tax thing right, or if you're trying to play fast and loose with the rules, that will get you in trouble faster than anything else, because that is the thing, collecting taxes is the thing that governments care about the most. So if maybe just a couple sentences on the difference between contractor and employee, in case there's anyone here who doesn't know the difference, but a contractor would be responsible generally for paying their own taxes, and an employee relationship, the employer has the obligation of not only withholding the taxes from the pay, but also paying them to the taxing authority. So if you come to an EOR who said, hey, we can do this a lot cheaper, a lot easier, we won't call anybody an employee, we'll just call everybody a contractor. Huge red flag, huge red flag. You are going to get in trouble. Your employee is going to have a leverage over you to complain to the taxing authorities if they're ever upset with you, if they ever like we talked about early in the call, when the employer-employee relationship terminates, that's when you have the biggest risk that employee themselves might very well go to the regulator and say, hey, these people were operating in a non-compliant way. They weren't withholding taxes. They weren't paying the type of benefits that an employee should get, because they were lying and calling me a contractor instead of an employee. And unfortunately, there are people in the companies in the EOR space that are doing just that. And I would be very leery of that. There are places where you can evaluate your risk and say, okay, I can take on a little more risk in this particular area, but there are also areas that you just need to avoid. And you quickly fall into the category of not just being non-compliant, but being absolutely illegal, committing fraud, tax evasion. Aiding and abetting in tax evasion is a criminal offense in most jurisdictions. That means that your directors, your board is potentially liable on a criminal level, and you don't want to be in that category. It's not worth it. It's better to find an EOR that can guide you through that misclassification. And at Omnipresent, we actually have a tool for this that's truly amazing. You go through our misclassification analysis, and as long as you pass that analysis, if you hire someone as a contractor, and then any government regulatory authority later challenges that and says that we were wrong and this person should have been an employee, we insure against all of that risk. So we would pay all the fines and that kind of thing related to that, back salary, anything you suffered. So not only does the tool help you make the right decision, because it can be a gray area sometimes between, is this person an employee or are they a contractor? But at the end of the day, the tool helps you make that analysis, and then you have the guarantee behind it. So it's a really nice thing. But I think, to get to your specific question, Kaylee, about what are we seeing in the EOR space where other companies are playing fast and loose, definitely in that misclassification analysis.
Super, super helpful. Yeah, this is so awesome. You guys are running the show yourselves. I don't even need to be here. You have so much to talk about. This is really genuinely so helpful. And so, yeah, let's talk about switching just super briefly, and then we'll jump back up to some of the entity questions that we got. But yeah, are there common talk tracks when folks are switching of things they weren't happy with? Maybe it directly relates to what you just said, Stan, around misclassification. Anything else, Alex, that comes up at that sort of conversion moment?
Yeah, do you know what I think is really interesting is, I think if you imagine why a lot of people might switch EOR providers, a lot of people might say price. But interestingly, we have quite a lot of people coming to Omnipresent, and sometimes they'll be paying a little bit more with us than they were with their previous providers. But the reason that is because the level of customer support they are receiving and the guidance they are receiving from their EOR is so poor that the amount it is costing them, having to engage with external legal counsels, their own people's time, means they are spent their true cost of their EOR is actually far, far greater. I think over and over again, we see that people maybe underestimate the amount of support they're going to require from their employer of record once the employee is actually set up. And this could be, something as simple as you have an employee that needs to take some additional leave because somebody in their family is unwell. And really quickly, that company is going to want to get an answer on how they can best support that employee relative to the country that they're set up in. Because as we know, how an employee would be supported would be very different depending on the country they were in. Now, if you can't get an answer and actually sort that out with the employee, that's a really poor experience for your employee and could be really detrimental to the relationship. And what we're seeing is these types of scenarios coming up over and over again, and EORs failing to be able to give the company, their customers, the support that they need to be able to ensure like a smooth employee relationship. And that at the end of the day has got to be one of the most important things, ensuring that that employee relationship stays positive.
Super helpful. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And that's a really nice like way of bucketing some of the reasons and why someone might be looking to switch. Awesome. Okay, so changing directions slightly to a couple of questions that came in around entity versus PEO versus EOR. So maybe to be clear with my first question for you, Stan, let's talk about the difference between PEO and EOR. So one of our question askers wanted to understand like what's the legal difference and what would be the use case for each of those, and maybe what is each of those, if in case anybody doesn't know.
Absolutely. So PEO, Professional Employer Organization, is very different, a different setup than EOR, Employer of Record. And the most fundamental difference is if you have a PEO, that means the client, the day-to-day employer, already has an entity, a corporation set up in that country. EOR is exactly the opposite. In the EOR space, the EOR company, as far as the government is concerned, would be the employer of record, and the client does not have any entity, no corporation in country. But how does it work practically? There are some similarities. So in both setups, in your PEO and your EOR, the PEO or the EOR provider would take care of things like payroll, benefits, healthcare, on and on and on, all of those administrative tasks and the fundamental requirements that are required to be compliant. All of that is taken care of. But in the PEO setup, there is a lot more risk for the client because the client is the employer of record. So if the regulator comes calling, if the government comes calling, it is your company on the line. You're the one who has filed as a corporation in that country, and you're the one on the line. If it's the same situation, the government comes calling for some reason, and it's an EOR model, then it's the EOR company that's on the line. That means that my team goes to court, and we, in some way, shape, or form, have to answer to the taxing authority or to the regulator or to the employer tribunal or whatever the form might be. So that's the big distinction between those two models. And the great thing is that one company might need those different types of models in different countries. So if I have a company in the United States, I might just need Omnipresent's PEO services in the United States. But if I want to go higher in Mexico, if I don't have a company set up already in Mexico, then I can still use Omnipresent in their EOR offering to do that.
Okay, awesome. That's super helpful. And I realize I totally skipped over the entity setup question.
Yeah.
So maybe just to toss that in as another element, when are typically people thinking about entity versus just EOR? Is there a certain threshold? I'm sure that's different country by country. Yeah, how to sort of conceptualize that thinking?
Yeah, and in the corporate life cycle, this changes over time. And this is, again, why you want an EOR that can help give you advice on these kinds of things, even though you also want your own advice on some of these issues. You'd want your own external counsel advising you as a corporation, but your EOR should be able to play a role here too. And so the question is, let's say that you go into, I'll demonstrate it with a hypothetical, let's say you go into Spain, and you start with 10 employees that are mostly giving you some administrative help, supporting the team. Maybe your main office is and your main target market is in Germany, and the Spanish employees are sort of supporting that. EOR is a great model there, and you really don't have to worry about anything. The EOR company is the employer of record as far as the government's concerned. and they take a lot of that risk and day-to-day administrative stuff off of your hands. Let's say, though, that the corporation in 10 years works up to 100 employees in Spain, and now you've got a sales force and you decide to start marketing directly to uh, the Spanish market, then that might be the time that you would want to talk to your EOR about, hey, does it make sense for us just to open our own entity? And if we do open our own entity, can you still support us with benefits? Can you still support us in with healthcare, with other things that come along with it? So it's an ongoing dialogue. It's an ongoing an analysis, and it's one of the main reasons that having a long-term relationship with your EOR can really be a powerful guide for your company as you expand. And there may be 5 countries where you decide, okay, it'd be great to have entities here, but we also want to have some employees in 10 other countries, and we're not going to worry about all the costs, the maintenance, the corporate secretary functions, all of that come along with setting up your own entity.
Yeah, super helpful. Okay, that's awesome. So now we've kind of answered fully like the legal side of the entity EOR PEO definitions. Is there anything from your side, Alex, around entity or PEO where you're sort of seeing themes with clients or examples maybe of our clients that have like come in via EOR and transitioned to need to establish an entity? Any other like, yeah, sort of stories from the front lines?
I'd say like one interesting use case that we often get is people might come to us and view Omnipresent as like a bridge to an entity. So they'll come to us and say, hey, like we are really keen to set up a sales function in the US, but it's going to take us a while to sort that out. So what we're going to do is set up 3 people with you, but in 12 months time, we're going to transfer them to our own entity. What I find really interesting about that use case is what we actually see is that often doesn't happen and they don't end up making the transfer. And I think there's a few reasons for that. I think the first is they often realize how cost effective it is to be using an employer of record for, a fairly small number of employees. And actually, they don't need to go and establish that entity. So once they set up with us, they actually realize like this is a really great solution for us. And now we don't need to spend X amount of time, X amount of money going and establishing an entity until maybe we really do have this larger presence that we feel it is necessary. So I always think it's interesting when we hear that from people about like the bridge plan and like whether or not it ends up being a reality. Also because I think they might see in the US a really good example of this, where an EOR can be quite a big cost saver is when it comes to things like benefits. In the US, obviously, benefits are a really important part of your package. And if you're looking to secure benefits on behalf of quite a small number of employees, it can be very, very expensive. And getting a really high standard of benefits for those small number of employees can be even harder. So actually, again, engaging with Omnipresent can mean that you can do that, offer an amazing benefits package that you just normally would not be able to do. So yeah, that's definitely something probably from the sales side we see a little bit when it comes to that EOR to entity transition.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, Alex, especially in the U.S. And of course, I'm based in the United States, so this is near and dear to my heart. Having run businesses in the United States, small businesses, I can tell you that it is a real challenge to be able to recruit. And because you can't offer, if you're a small business, you can't, or a small number of employees, you can't offer the level of benefits that the top candidates would require, because you just don't have the power to go in front of an insurance company and say, hey, with 3 or 4 employees, I really want this great package. It gets to be so expensive. What we do at Omnipresent is we throw your 3 employees in with all of our other employees, and now we have the bargaining power to really get a nice benefit package. And I think if I were hiring in the U.S. and I had a company outside of the U.S., that would probably be one of my main reasons for wanting to use EOR or PEO in the United States.
That's super helpful. That makes a lot of sense. Oh, I think we got our first question. Okay, we'll leave a little bit of time at the end, but we're making great time. I'm going to bounce down. We've talked a lot about evaluating EOR providers. So I think we've covered out those questions. Maybe one more in this bucket of risk and evaluation that we were all kind of talking about yesterday is how does a company's like risk tolerance play into their decision to work with or choose an EOR provider? And Alex, I think you had an interesting perspective on this of just how that might shift how people approach it, and again, just what you need to be thinking about. I think this risk element has been woven throughout this whole presentation.
Kaylee, my mic just completely dipped. Sorry, could you just put...
Oh, you're good. Yeah, repeat the question. 100%. Risk tolerance. So we were talking about this yesterday. Like companies have different appetites for risk that might inform what they're choosing, but there's also this long-term element of needing to think about how that might come back and affect you. So yeah, if you could just speak to sort of how to conceptualize risk tolerance when you're thinking about global hiring.
Yeah, I mean, and I think Stan has a great analogy from this. So I think we can talk about, he can give his analogy in a little bit. But absolutely, like, of course, we would never want to say that the employer of record is a completely risk-free model. Something that we always talk to our clients about is permanent establishment risk. And that's something they really appreciate, is that understanding that it doesn't eliminate or take away all risk using an employer of record model. And Stan, I know we were talking before this about like the responsibilities that our clients have, as well as the ones that Omnipresent has. And it's really important that we lay those out to our clients at the beginning. But I think what's really important and that we've seen is there are lots of EORs springing up on the market at the moment. And some of them are maybe using employment models that we would say are definitely more risky. Sometimes that means they're able to offer much lower costs. And of course, we can't say that 100% they are going to end up being in, a legal situation as a result of using one of these less compliant models. However, it does put you at a lot more risk engaging with an EOR provider that isn't using a fully licensed model. And Stan, maybe this is a good point for you to talk a bit more about your analogy before I talk about, like, Italy, for example, is a good example of one of the countries where you need to be really careful.
Yeah, the analogy I always use is you may very well get in your car and drive every day for the rest of your life at twice the speed limit, and you may very well never get pulled over. But the chances of that are slimmer. The more risk you take, the higher the speed you drive, and the longer you try to break the rules, the better the chance that you're eventually going to get in trouble. And I would really, really caution our clients about being tempted away by a low-cost, brand-new EOR provider who tries to tell you that that they're doing something that we have warned you is highly risky. And maybe this is a good time, Alex, if you want to talk about Italy or a couple of the other countries.
Yeah.
This is probably. I mean, you can absolutely play. Put your foot into the pedal of the car and drive as fast as you want, but you're going to get burned sooner or later. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah. Thank you, Stan. And I mean, I've talked a bit about Germany because that's a really popular country for hiring. So that is one that we definitely need to be careful of when it comes to that 18-month employer of record restriction. But Italy's a really interesting one. And one thing we would always say about Italy is a very employee-friendly country. So if we think of somewhere like the US, for example, we might say that that is a bit more of an employer-friendly country, because when it comes to things like terminations in the US, you're generally going to go through a more simple process. However, what that means in Italy is the EOR model is highly regulated. So in order for us to operate compliantly, we follow the requirements that are set out in a labour leasing legal framework. And what we've realised, especially in the last 12 months, actually, is that there are quite a high percentage of EOR providers who are actually not operating under this model. So they are instead using like a consulting or like a service-led entity approach. And this is really important because actually under Italian law, employees can only provide services to a company which is also their legal employer. But the exception to this is through labour leasing, which permits a third party to use these services. So really important that you check with your employer of record that they are using the correct model here. And you can actually ask them, because you can ask to see a certificate to show this. So I believe the kind of shorthand is like ANPAL, ANPAL, that you can ask to see. And that's something that we can kind of show our clients. And I don't know whether I'm going into too much detail here, but there are some serious risks if companies are hiring under these non-regulated consulting type models. And that really comes down to a considerable increase in termination costs. So that thing that Stan was talking about earlier, when your employee's off board, employees can threaten to report their employer for being hired under this model, and this can lead to like significant costs on behalf of the company, which would hugely outweigh any cost savings they might have made by using, like a very like low cost provider. Although one thing I would say actually is it's not just low cost providers who are using this model. We're seeing it across the kind of board.
Yeah, and Italy is a great example of how you can get yourself in trouble here. So under the labor leasing laws, let's get all the way to termination. If we're terminating someone in Italy under the compliant, correct way that we operate, what you would do is you would put that person, you would alert that person that they're being terminated. You put them in a 6-month recruiting cycle, and during that time, you don't have to pay very much at all. And then at the end of that 6-month recruiting cycle, if that person is not employed, then you can terminate them safely, and you don't have to pay any more salary. If you're under one of these other models that Alex has mentioned, here's what happens. You go to terminate the employee, he threatens to go to the employer tribunal, and the employees in Italy, just culturally, this is where culture comes in again, have access to attorneys. They know how to get employment attorneys. There's lots of them that advertise their services for just this situation. And so they will get an attorney, and what you thought you were being generous by offering, for example, let's say that you offered this employee a 1-month severance. You thought you were being generous, and he gets an attorney, and the attorney comes back and says, nope, we would like 12-month severance, and if you don't, we're going to the tribunal, and we're going to allege that your model is non-compliant, and they're going to win. So you really have to, like Alex was saying, especially in countries where there are plenty of EOR providers who are playing fast and loose, the onboardings may look exactly the same. So if you're with a non-compliant EOR in Italy, the way Omnipresent onboards you and the way the non-compliant company onboards you might look the same. But when you get to the end of that relationship, you will not have saved any money at all.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I think having a concrete example like Italy to play with and understand actually brings a lot of life to some of these things, which can sound abstract when you're talking about risk tolerance and stuff, but you bring it to life and it makes a ton of sense.
And what Alex was talking about right there, Callie, before we go on, is not a hypothetical. We literally have had those situations
Totally.
and seen that play out, and it can be quite the sticker shock when you have a mid-level employee who comes to you and says, oh yeah, I won't be working for the next 12 months, but you will pay me in one lump sum. That can be quite the shocking conversation. And he has an attorney that's backing him up to do it. Go ahead, Callie. And then we need to move on to another topic.
I think the real life understanding the real tangible consequences is really, really helpful to make these examples make sense. So to jump into sort of slightly different set of questions, we'll move a little rapid fire. These are 3 that were submitted, a couple before, one that just came in during the event. So I'll kind of popcorn them and you both can jump in however makes sense. First one is, are you able, and this actually kind of relates to what you're just talking about, but are you able to post for a position before dismissing the current employee? I'm sure the answer depends, country, setup, etc. But yeah, whoever wants to jump in on that one first.
I will say this. you can get it. It is a country by country analysis. You definitely, this is another example where you want to be working with an EOR who you can get on the phone and ask this question to. But if you are in a number of the EMEA countries, and you're going through a redundancy, in other words, if you're terminating the employee under a redundancy model and you've already posted for that position, you don't make redundant the person, you make redundant the role. So by posting it, you would immediately be in a non-compliance situation with your redundancy. So I would be very cautious if I was trying to get rid of a group of employees under a redundancy model and posting for new hires at the same time, because here's what it looks like to the authorities. The authorities think you're not being truthful, that this is a true redundancy need, and instead you just want to terminate the person, but you don't want to go through the performance analysis that you would normally have to go through in many countries before you terminate someone.
Super helpful. That makes perfect sense.
On the other hand, if you want to move
Yeah.
faster, just make sure you go through the performance steps. So you can go ahead and post for that job, and you can put the person on a PIP, a performance improvement plan, and go through that process. And there's nothing wrong with that. Most governments understand that if you have a low performing employee, you need to be able to post to hire somebody to replace them, and you need to be able to compliantly move them off of your books.
Got it. That nuance is really helpful. I'll popcorn right to the next one. And Alex, we were just talking about this before this event, but who is responsible for monitoring leave? Is it the UR or the company or the person doing the work? And again, case by case, but yeah, you had some good points around just how to conceptualize this type of question.
Yeah, so employee leave is obviously something that is always going to be really important to consider when you're hiring in a country where you don't have a legal entity. So Omnipresent would, of course, guide you on what is the minimum amount of leave required by law. Now, in many cases, companies might choose to extend that leave. And of course, we'll never be able to offer less than the statutory in a country, but we can often include more leave, or even if you are a very generous company, you might offer like unlimited paid leave. So we would be able to change the employment contract to reflect that. Now, in terms of monitoring that leave, we actually have direct integrations with like the top 45 HRISs. So you would simply set whatever the leave allowance that you've agreed with Omnipresent in your own HRIS. So say that is 25 days of annual leave, and then your employee would go and submit leave to their manager as in any kind of normal relationship. And that would push automatically through to our platform. So our payroll team is able to account for it. So just in any other way, you would monitor your employee's leave. You would do it exactly the same for your EOR employee, but you would have our guidance to support you on the kind of statutory amount of leave that you're able to offer them.
And I might just add to that there's a legal aspect to this that, like everything else we've talked about today, requires country by country analysis. And so to some degree, the client will be monitoring this, but you also want an EOR provider who understands it. For example, if you've got somebody who's going out on some sort of medical or paternity leave, the Fair Medical Leave Act in the United States has very different requirements than paternity leave in Germany. There are some states in the United States that still don't recognize any paternity leave at all. So, you know, those are the kinds of nuances that you want to do it. And I think this is a good example, a good question, Kaylee, to emphasize something that I tell our clients all the time. And that is, even when you use an EOR, there's obligations on both sides of the equation. So I always say that the employer-employee relationship is like a bundle of sticks. And so if you have a bundle of sticks and you're using an EOR model, some of those sticks you're going to hand to the EOR, and these are the EOR's obligations. They need to run and take care of it. That, though, does not mean that you also don't have continuing obligations as the day-to-day employer, and you really need to know where those are. You might need to get external advice on those obligations. You still have the obligation not to discriminate against employees. You still have the obligation not to put them in harm's way in a health and safety kind of thing. You have the obligation not to engage in sexual harassment and a hostile workplace environment. All of those things still remain with the day-to-day employer. So you really need to know, you know, when the question of who's responsible for monitoring leave. And as Alex explained, it goes both sides. It's entering the data, but it's also knowing the rules per country. It's a good time to emphasize the fact that in this EOR space, there's still obligations for the client as well as the EOR provider, and those need to really be clear in everybody's mind so that the relationship works well.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I think just like bringing that point home again of that this isn't obligation free and it's a dynamic relationship and everybody's got different responsibilities is really important. I can see one audience question more around where Omnipresent as a company hires. So I will actually follow up with you directly via email on that. We do the same as our clients. We hire globally. So I'll answer that directly. So if anybody else has questions in our last 10 minutes, feel free to drop them in. Otherwise, I think let's do a couple minutes again on this evaluation question, and then but we'll end with your top advice for folks considering hiring globally for the first time. So maybe just to come back to you, Alex, around why people trust us, and this idea of tech and person-led support and why that's important in this world. And you've kind of already alluded to it with these HR platform integrations. I think that's super important to think about this tech stack. But yeah, anything else to kind of add there?
Yeah, I think we've really understood that obviously having a platform is really important because there is a big kind of administrative part that a platform can handle. And we have a great platform that helps you kind of with the onboarding of the employee, with them managing things like their expenses, with you being able to view documents, with you being able to have a look at your invoices, all the things that you would expect a kind of tech-enabled platform to be able to assist you in. And I'm always really pleased to hear that we have, like how-to guides on how to use our Omni platform, but apparently no one ever actually uses them because it is very intuitive. Like it's one of those things you log into and you're straight away up and running with it. So it's a great platform for that, for employees and of course the HR and wider teams that are using them. But I think what we've also really understood at Omnipresent is that you need that blend of a people-led expertise or person-led expertise to help you navigate those more complex situations. So that could be, as we've talked about a little bit today, a termination or maybe a dispute that you're having with an employee. It could also be that you are thinking about hiring across a few different locations and actually you aren't ready yet to add that employee to the platform. But what you want to do is have a conversation with an expert in our team to understand, well, what are the costs of hiring going to look like in those countries? What do I need to think about from a benefits perspective? What would I need to think about if I wanted to put, maybe it's a very high paid sales role and you want to have quite a long probation period on that. Well, what are my options from a legal stance going to be in hiring across these countries? And really that's as well where our team and their knowledge really comes into play, because we're able to really guide you through that process and help you think about strategic hiring decisions before you actually get to our platform. And I think that's where you need that blend of human-led expertise alongside a platform.
And I think, Kelly, in a perfect world, what we would love to see is the entire world, no matter where you hire, everybody has one set of rules, one set of laws, and you don't have to worry about these geographical differences. But we're not in that world. We live in a very different world. But I think the Omni platform tries to get as close as possible to that, because we want it to look the same client-facing to the client who has an employee in Germany as as their employee in the US. And so that's where the Omni platform really, really shines, because that's where we've done the hard work. There may be a completely different business model for hiring the person in the US and the person in Germany and the person in Italy and the person in Spain and the person in Portugal, but all of your employees are seen in one platform, and you deal with the day-to-day through that platform. And it's a great way. And the integration with the HRIS that Alex has told us about is really, really amazing.
That was such a good answer. Thank you both. I don't think I've posed it in that way in terms of specifically thinking through tech plus human expertise, and that makes a ton of sense. Okay, that basically brings us to our closing question. Let me double check. I don't think anything else has been submitted. If anyone sneaks one in, I'll keep an eye out for the next couple minutes. But yeah, maybe a couple minutes each. I'll start with you, Stan, of just if you could give one piece of advice to a company that's hiring globally for the first time. Both of you have given tons of takeaways, I think, today. But if you kind of had to wrap it up in a nutshell, what would that piece of advice be?
I'm going to surprise you, Callie. I'm not going to give a legal answer. Here's
Oh.
what I would advise a company that was thinking about hiring globally for the first time. Don't be afraid. Just go do it. It is absolutely true that there is more talent than than you can even imagine out there, and there's talent in places all around the world, and and use the technology we have today, being able to have a Zoom call or a live stream call like we're having a webinar like we're having right now, the ability to work through Zoom. We do it. We practice what we preach. Like Alex said, we practice what we preach here at Omnipresent. We literally are a fully remote company, and it works really well. And you will be a stronger company because you have insights from a diverse group all around the world that will make you stronger. You see different perspectives, you see different ideas. So my advice, my non-legal advice to your question, Callie, is if you are thinking about hiring globally, give it a try. EOR makes it very, very easy to do. And you've got somebody there holding your hand the whole way, and the benefits will be even the intangible benefits of just having someone's perspective on a different side of the world than where you see and live and work and walk around every day will be immense in ways that you can't even imagine. So there's my surprising non-legal answer for that question, Callie. Over to you, Alex.
Yeah, I really like that, Stan. Just go for it. And it's so true. Like there's so much to be gained from being able to open up your hiring to a kind of global workforce and we see some amazing case studies with our clients where, they've really struggled to hire these really maybe very expert technical roles in a small geographical location. And then when they're able to open it up to, one of the 150 countries that we're able to support in, the kind of wealth of talent they see is amazing. And that also adds to their team hugely, being able to bring in a whole new person from a different continent, potentially with a whole different culture. So what that's able to bring to the team, it's amazing. But in terms of my one piece of advice, mine's probably a bit different, Stan, in that it's very specific and it kind of relates to when you're in the buying journey and you're trying to work out who is the right provider for me, and everyone's telling you maybe similar things about their services. What I would really advise is going and asking a difficult question to your EOR. And that would be, so let's take the country that you're hiring in. I would ask that EOR a difficult question about maybe it's what would happen in case we wanted to terminate this person's employment outside of their probation, and send that same question to every provider and compare their response, because that will give you a really good understanding of how much knowledge, how much expertise that company really has. And of course, they're all going to tell you they're compliant, but it's the proof is in the pudding, as the phrase goes. So yeah, that would probably be my piece of inside advice when you're trying to pick between providers.
I love that. That is super helpful. And great sort of different tones from both of you to end on in terms of jump in the deep end, go for it, and be thoughtful as you're choosing a provider, ask the difficult questions. I think that themes run throughout today's presentation. And I love that idea of posing the same one and just seeing the answer. And that ties back to what Stan started us with, which is think about that offboarding moment as well, not just the exciting first steps when your employee joins, but what's happening at the end of that relationship. Wow, that flew by. That brings us to the top of the hour. Thank you, Stan and Alex, so much for coming and sharing all of your expertise. Thank you to everyone who joined us or who is watching the recording after this event. If you join and or watch the recording, you'll get an email immediately after with a link to book a call if you do want to chat with our team and you have further questions you want to dig into live. Otherwise, we're always around via email for for other questions. And yeah, we hope this session kind of helped cut through the noise, give you a little bit more clarity on how to think through jumping into a global hiring journey and evaluating a provider. And we look forward to continuing to connect with you all soon. Thanks again, Stan and Alex. This was awesome.
Thank you. Thank you, Callie.
Have
Great
a good
job,
rest of your
moderator.
day.
Thank you.
See ya.
Bye. Bye, team.